Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about callback interviews. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about callback interviews. Welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, first off, what is a callback interview?
So basically, a callback interview is sort of a second round of interviews after you've had your initial screening interview with one person, and it's usually going to involve 5 to 6 lawyers in kind of the same, amount of time that you had your screen interview with each person.
Right. And so typically pre-pandemic, this would have meant that you physically went to the law firm wherever you were interviewing, regardless really of where it was. They would fly you out. You'd stay in a hotel, you'd have all this stuff. But a lot of these moved virtual, I know, for the pandemic. Is that still the case across the board?
So my understanding is it's probably somewhere around 50-50 at this point. I think that the law firms where people are physically in the office, usually the student gets a choice. Either they want to do it in person or they want to do it virtually. And I think either one is fine. You're not going to be judged based on what you pick. And it sounds like, there's still limited lawyers that are going in person, even for the places where they are supposed to be back in the office. I think a lot of them are still virtual. So I would say, it could be either way, and probably it'll be your preference.
That makes sense. I mean, I know the firm that I worked for, I think, has moved remote option for everyone forever. So although apparently a surprising number of people are still actually showing up into the office. But, I think this depends a lot, in different cities, people are doing different things. Yeah, so you don't think there's any downside to doing it virtually?
No, not at all. And it might be a little easier to schedule, is sort of the upside. If there's limited lawyers in the office, maybe there's fewer spots,
right.
And you might have to be more flexible. On the other hand, if you want to see the office in person, there are advantages to that, and I think that's fine too.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, if assuming you get the offer, you could always ask to go into the office at that point as well, and it would just be a little bit less formal. But, they're usually happy to set you up with more people to talk to and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I agree. I don't think people should feel super pressured to go in person, that it's some sort of huge advantage, particularly if you're living somewhere else. Say you're in school in New York, you're interviewing in California, I was doing that. It's a royal pain. I had to fly out here. I had to stay in a hotel. It was right in the middle of, all the stuff going on for classes. So, if you can avoid that, I think there's an argument to be made for doing that.
Absolutely. And even before this, if you're in that situation, usually you group, the callbacks together, and you absolutely should in this situation. Usually they sort of request it and they work with the different firms, on paying for it. So definitely keep that in mind. I would think you'd want to just do it in one shot and not make multiple trips. So just, something else if you need to travel somewhere to do it in person.
Yeah. All right. Well, if somebody has a callback, what should they be thinking about or be prepared to talk about?
Well, I think that it is sort of similar to the initial screen interview, in terms of, know everything on your own resume. So everything is comfortable for you to talk about, why you want to be at that firm, things about their practice groups, where they're located, the culture, that kind of thing. It's going to be obviously a lot more, repeating things over and over again. in a row. So I think you want to, be similarly prepared to talk about your background and why you want to be at the firm, but you're going to have to, just do it over a much longer period of time. And you want to be prepared with more, I would say, questions, because there probably will be more time to ask questions in, this more extensive interview.
I agree. And I think there's a little bit higher expectation, possibly, that you know a little more about the firm. I mean, I don't think people have to go crazy, but people understand that in those first round of screening interviews that you do back to back to back, like, you probably didn't do a super deep dive into this particular firm before you decide to sign up. Maybe you did. But I think for the callback, at a minimum, you want to be very familiar with their website, the type of work that they do, where they have offices. Do you think people need to do a ton of research on the people that they're going to be interviewing with when they get their schedule?
Not a ton. I mean, I think you should be familiar and you should know what practice group they're in, sort of, what their careers look like, everything just on the basic bio. On the other hand, I never suggest you do too much because you don't want to get freaked out if they switch it up at the last minute, which happens often. So you don't want to be so tied to you knew exactly who you were going to interview with and you were only prepared for them. And I just think that overdoing it, can kind of put you in a corner with that. So you definitely should be familiar with whatever schedule they gave you, but you should be able to be flexible, and kind of roll with it if some totally different person shows up. And they're going to know that they just got it added on, so that's fine.
Yeah, and I think at a minimum, you kind of want to know, like, oh, okay, this person's the partner, and this person is like a first-year associate. So.
And if there's a particular practice group, because probably they've asked you what you're interested in, and they know something about your background, and they've probably at least tried to have a few interviewers that really fit. So I would be especially prepared, if it's an area you've said you want to practice in, and that's, the partner in the group. You want to probably know a little bit more.
Yeah, and I don't think, like you said, you need to go totally crazy here. I mean, occasionally people will do like a really deep dive on the internet and then like bring things up. I remember when I was doing like on the other side of interviews, people would sometimes, bring up some weird factoid about my college experience or something. And I'm like, how much time have you spent Googling me? Like, this is a little weird.
Absolutely. I would stick with their professional bio and maybe their LinkedIn.
Right.
But not go into their social media.
Yeah, exactly. Stick to the professional. And also, I mean, I think people sometimes get paranoid. Like, nobody's going to quiz you about their background or anything like that. I mean, occasionally people might run into an aggressive interviewer, but the reality is they're probably that's how they are. And they're probably doing that with everyone. But I think that is something that people really get worked up about. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that people sort of overthink it. I also think that in that kind of situation and in a lot of these things where maybe you're thrown something that you didn't expect, it's more about how you act about it than it is about you having the right answer, or knowing the right thing to say. It's more like, can you kind of roll with the situation and like, be comfortable. You don't necessarily need to have the answer to everything, but, as a lawyer, you're going to be giving lots of situations where you weren't prepared and you didn't know the answer. And can you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic one here is somebody like brings up one bad grade or something from your transcript. How do you think people should deal with that?
Short and, you can address it. If there is a specific reason, I think it's fine to quickly say it. There was like a personal issue or health issue. I think you can say that. And then I would immediately focus on, that was unfortunate, but I really had an upward trajectory, the next semester, focus on something positive. Even if you can't say that, I would sort of acknowledge it. You don't need to hide it, or if it's true, it's true, and then sort of move on from it. I definitely wouldn't like get into like a circle where you're continuing to talk about it or to explain it.
Right. And I think humor can also be effective here. I mean, obviously you're in the callback, you've passed the initial screening, probably your overall GPA is not that bad or you wouldn't be there. So if someone does bring up like, whoa, what happened to Civ Pro? like you know that question's probably coming if it's like the one bad grade on your transcript from someone will ask you about that. But, I think having some response that's light, that's ready to go, and that redeflects into the positive is always good. So, oh yeah, gosh, boy, was that class a total mess. Like, whoo. But as you can see, I did pretty well the rest of the semester. You don't really have to have an answer.
Exactly. And that's a situation where, there's nothing you can do to change the grade.
Right,
so
exactly.
I think it's kind of jerky to ask about it personally.
It is. But someone will.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's who they are, not who you are.
Like, I would never have asked about that, but somebody else would.
I guess I just feel like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Because, the grade's on the paper.
Yeah. I think some people, maybe they're legitimately curious. I don't know. Give them the benefit of the doubt. But, yeah, basically they're just being a jerk and, like, seeing if you can handle the pressure. So, do not complain about your professor. Don't complain about anything. Just like, Lee has a good answer to her one bad grade, which was her first year legal writing, our first semester. And she says, yeah, that class didn't go well. Like, I was the first year, I learned something. And then if you see, I tallied the class the next semester. Nobody's going to give you a hard time about that.
Absolutely. And yeah, I always think it's good if there's something positive you can sort of move on from it with.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, I learned something, and weirdly, like, I still want to be a litigator, even with that terrible Civ Pro,
Yeah.
I'm taking some more classes next year to, like, try to make sure I know the information, whatever. Yeah, proactive, light, like, don't freak out about it, I think is the key.
And you're a human, they're a human, like, we're not robots, we're not perfect. It's fine to acknowledge that. Yeah, that's a good point. But I always think it's good to show some of, like, your personality. I think that is part of what they're looking for in the callback process.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because as I alluded to, presumably you are basically qualified or you would not be sitting in the callback interviews. So what are firms really looking for in callbacks?
So first of all, I always tell students that, in a way, the callback should be sort of a relief because, the initial round is basically trying to figure out if you're qualified. So grades rarely come into it in the callback or academic performance. Occasionally, if they're deciding, like, at the very end, maybe they would look at it. But generally, if you made it to the callback, you are deserving of an offer. A lot of people call it different things, like the X factor or a sparkle. I could name 10 different things I've heard various firms say. But sort of this, thing that you have that'll be interesting and make you fit in with that particular firm or that particular culture. So that's definitely, like, high on the list in the callback. I feel like everyone's sort of evaluating you for, do they want to work with you as a colleague? It can be long hours. You can have to go on long business trips. So, like, are you someone who's going to be a team player? It may be specific to a practice group too at some places. So, are you a fit for that practice group? Do you have the right background? But I think a lot of it really is who you are. Would you be a good colleague there?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was doing interviews, that was kind of the only thing I really cared about was, can this person talk to me for 20 to 30 minutes, preferably about something that is not law related. So, I definitely went hard usually on, like, the hobbies and interest section of the resume and kind of gave people softball questions about that, really just to see, like, can they hold a conversation? Would I be able to tolerate this person if I had to work with them? You're looking for somebody who doesn't sound like a jerk. They don't sound entitled. And they can put, two words together and not just sit there and, like, make me talk for 30 minutes.
Totally. And I think a mistake some students make is focusing too much on the academic side when preparing, so they can talk about all their classes or a specific paper or their summer internship, but then they, like, can't get off that topic, or, like, every prepared answer is only law related. And I actually think what you said is true for a lot of interviewers, which is they kind of want to talk to them about other things. Or, like, at least half. So be prepared to bring in other experiences you've had, in maybe like other jobs, or it could even be undergrad or a hobby or something you've devoted a lot of time to outside of law school. Because I do think you don't want to forget that they want to see who you are as like a person, not just a law student.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not that I'm giving anything away here, but my general line of questioning was basically like, oh, how do you like law school? Because that tells me basically, does this person have the judgment to tell me that they don't hate it? And also lets them kind of talk about, we are going to be doing legal work. Like if somebody can't talk about what they like or don't like, or, anything positive about law school, I probably don't want them in the same room. And from there, it was usually like, what kind of classes did you like or not like? Again, like just, can you talk about this type of stuff? And honestly, at that point, I would usually move into hobbies because I don't want to talk about law anymore. Like I do this all day long.
And I bet that makes it more interesting if you're doing a lot of interviews because you hear different answers from different people. Whereas if you ask them, the same, like only in the legal area, it might just be the same thing over and over again.
Right.
So I think it just like keeps it interesting.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to this earlier, but people definitely need to be prepared to kind of say the same thing over and over, which is really weird when you sit there and do 5 or 6 interviews. But anything that draws attention in your background or your resume, people are going to ask you about it. So, I had a weird background. I just owned that. People always looked at my resume and they went, tell me more about this. You went from sociology to architecture to programming to law. How does that fit together? And, I had this prepared answer that I would say literally 5 or 6 times a day, and everyone kind of go, oh, okay, and then move on. But you need to have that kind of honed about anything that people, and also if you've been asked about it a couple of times in an interview already, that for the next ones, you need an answer.
Absolutely. And I think this is not so much about that there is like a right answer, to explain your background. And that's the key, that you said the exact right thing. It's about the fact that you were comfortable, you thought about it, you'd put it together, you knew that was coming, that kind of thing. I don't think that there's, a set way to explain things that's right and another one that's wrong. It's just about you being able to explain it and being comfortable with it and having it make sense and not be too complicated.
Right. I mean, I knew people were going to talk about this. I mean, it is a weird background. And so my story was sort of like, oh, well, it's actually pretty interesting. Like designing a brief is not that different from designing a house or designing a database. Like it's all kind of the same thought process. I would usually pause at that point, and if somebody wanted to talk more about it, I could explain to them why I thought that was the case. But if they were like, oh, okay, and moved on, then like that was great too. Like I don't want to talk about the same thing all day.
I think that's a great answer. I really like, finding a connection between things. It's just interesting and it makes sense, and not everything has to, look exactly right on paper to make sense when you talk about it. Also, if like, let's say, for example, you took a semester, you're off, let's say, I don't know, you had an illness or a sick family member or something, you can explain that quickly. You don't need to go into detail. I feel like that's where people get off the rails about some of that weird stuff, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it's this really big sob story. It's just like, I think can be weird in an interview. So just be able to explain all this stuff succinctly.
I completely agree. I think you should have like your 20 to 30 second answer for the questions you're going to get. And then you should have sort of like your 2 to 3 minute answer. And you should give the short answer and then pause and see what their reaction is. And if they want more, and you can even say, I'm happy to talk more about this, but I'll leave that to you. And if they ask for more, sure, go into your 2-minute answer, but don't give that originally. I think in general, people tend to sort of get nervous about things and over talk in a lot of these interviews. And certain people definitely have this tendency. And if you do have that tendency, I think you need to be aware of it and make sure that you're cutting yourself off and saying, oh, would you like more information about any of this? Or, do you want me to go on? And let them kind of say yes or no. And if they say no, then stop talking.
Absolutely. And this is where you really should practice this kind of thing with other people, because it may not be something that feels as long as it does to the other person.
Right.
And especially when you keep going, there's always that part where that thought ends. And then if there's even like one little space, they'll just keep talking.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to be that person. I 100% think that that's like a big issue. It's also an issue when you practice answers word for word, which I highly recommend you not do, because then people start feeling like, oh, they forgot that part,
Right.
and it's like they're going back to a script. And so I'd be really careful to avoid things like that. It can be more natural. You should hit, maybe some points that you've kind of reviewed in your head. But other than that, it's also a conversation. They might ask you a question. So like listen so that you can answer it really and not just say the answer that you were practicing.
That's very true. Like if you ask a question, you probably want the actual answer. This is not like a political debate where you have to redirect to something else. And if people have a tendency to monologue or a tendency to not really answer questions directly, I think that is something you definitely need to work on before these interviews, because it is very frustrating to be sitting in an interview for like 20 or 30 minutes as the interviewer while someone just talks at you.
Absolutely. And I think that students can get focused on having the right answer, and then they get into that mode, rather than like, it's okay if something sort of trips you up and you get a little off, but it's better for it to be like authentic and real.
Definitely. All right, well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about a few different scenarios that can come up with callbacks. Number one, and this one shouldn't happen, but sometimes it does. What if you're late, either for an in-person or a virtual interview?
So my advice is to acknowledge it and move on as quick as possible. So get there as soon as you can. So hopefully you're not too late. But I think the biggest issue with being late is just getting stuck in that mode and trying to explain it. And just like the whole interview goes off course. That's most what I've seen when that happens. So, if there's a reason, I guess you could say it really quick, but then I would just be ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't belabor this. You screwed up. Not looking great, but just like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, let's get started. All right. What if you're doing a virtual interview and either your internet connection isn't great, or your computer starts acting up? Like sometimes people start getting like lots of rings, or like it just crashes. What should you do in that scenario?
This is tough. First of all, I go back to, I think we've talked before, do whatever you can to make sure that you've tested it so that hopefully this doesn't happen. So try to head it off the best you can, but things do happen. I feel like we all know that at this point, and sometimes it's not the best connection. I think if you can keep going and basically be heard, I think it's fine to say to the other person, can you hear me? Because there's no point in talking if they can't hear you and they don't know what's going on. And maybe you say like, maybe we could start this again, or refresh it, or reschedule if it's that bad. But if it's not that bad and it's a little bit off, I do your best to just make it work and like try to ignore the thing that's going on in the background if it's something like that.
I agree. And one other thing I think you want to do in advance is make sure there's a backup plan if you're interviewing virtually. So like I did a virtual interview the other day for something, and they in advance said, okay, we want to make sure we have your phone number in case there's a problem with your internet connection. And so I think something like that is always good to kind of ask about if they haven't mentioned it. I mean, you don't want to like push on it, but I think it makes you look responsible. Like, hey, just in case there are any problems, like, is there a backup plan? Like, should I be ready to be on the phone? Whatever it is.
Absolutely. And I know I've had some, things with Zoom or other systems where it works better on the computer or the phone, so make sure also that you've checked if there's a certain browser that's better, if there's like an ideal setup, because sometimes it is just switching to another browser or something like that. But I agree. And with your internet, there are fluke things where the whole internet goes down.
Right.
And you have no connection. And that's right where a phone call would still work. and you can't control that. But, some things you can control, whether it's like checking the signal ahead of time, if you need to restart it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, one thing I always get worked up about when I have to do video calls is like, should I wear headphones or not headphones or which type of headphones? Like, I don't know. I mean, I think something like this probably doesn't really matter that much, but that's something because I have like, podcasting headphones that are huge, but they look weird. Like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, I will say, most of us wear AirPods all the time. I have found AirPods aren't great in this situation, so I would not use a Bluetooth thing.
Agreed.
I would use something that's like physically plugged in.
I agree. I usually just use like small headphones that actually plug in. I think that's the best.
Like the
option.
old Apple ones.
Exactly. Yeah. The old school ones you can get for like $10 on Amazon if you need them.
I agree. And obviously test it ahead of time.
Yeah, I think they're less obtrusive. And unless you have like a really nice setup already going on in your house or wherever you're doing this, I think just put yourself between you and a wall and like call it a day.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to be on like Rate My Room at this point or whatever for your interview.
Just keep it like as I think blank as possible.
I agree. All right. So you briefly alluded to this earlier. Your schedule gets switched around at the last minute. How do you handle that?
So this is similar to being late in that it's really about how you handle it, not that everything's perfect. Just don't make any big thing about it. Don't seem nervous. Don't seem like you don't know what to do. You just go with it. It's a different person. They know how to do an interview. They know that they just got switched around. They know that you don't know their background. That's fine. You can ask them questions, that are sort of general. So to me, this is really just about going with the flow. And that says a lot that it's no big deal.
Right. I definitely don't think you should be like, oh, I was really looking forward to interviewing with that person.
Or act like they are that person. Just assume they're in the same practice group or something like that.
I think sometimes people don't realize that like the hiring person who's interacting with them at the interview actually has a lot of power. So, I mean, I can imagine people would say things like that occasionally to you.
Yeah, it's really annoying because, I think it's better in that situation if you're talking to the hiring person, the recruiting person, that you sort of acknowledge like, oh, it must be really difficult to put all these schedules together.
Right.
Thank you so much. That's like the time to do that because, this happened because somebody had some kind of, scheduling issue or didn't show up. And it's hard to put all of these whole recruiting season together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people get held up in court or whatever. I mean, yeah, and the person who has to deal with all that fallout is basically you in that scenario. Like, be nice to you.
Yeah. I always really liked it when students were like, wow, this is a lot of work, thanks so much. Or they were like, I had a great time, thanks for that schedule, even if it's not true.
Right.
It's just nice.
Yeah, I think acknowledge the people who are actually like helping you out and are closest to the process is always a good look. Yeah. All right. Well, what if you are just not really connecting with a specific interviewer for whatever reason and the time is just dragging?
I think that's just life. You're going to be in situations with people that you don't connect with. I think if you connect with most of them, that's great. So I'd basically just say to yourself, like, all right, this is 30 minutes. It's not going to be super pleasant. I don't think you need to fill in every single blank. It's supposed to be on them to keep the interviewer going. Obviously, sometimes the heavy lifting does end up with the interviewee. So that's where, just have as many prepared questions as you can. And you kind of just think to yourself like, okay, this isn't my person, but I'm just going to make this go as smoothly as possible, because you're just not going to connect with everybody.
Yeah, and I think this is where having questions ready to go is useful, like a lot of questions, and also really, kind of having some curiosity about their answers. And I think sometimes students don't necessarily do that. So if you can ask somebody a question, even if it's like a question about, what does your typical day look like? Or what are some things that you're working on right now? That could either kill 10 seconds if they're like, oh, I'm working on a brief on this case. And then you move on. Or you can follow up, what's the client like? What's the case about? Like, are you going to court every day? Like, even now you'd be like, well, is court virtual or is it in person? Like, how is that working? Like, do you think there are pros and cons to that? Like, you can ask a lot of questions about basically nothing to kill time.
And that's a great example of that could feel like a terrible interview to you. But if they leave feeling like you made them feel good about their job, it's going to feel great and you're going to get a good review. So,
right. People love talking about themselves, particularly lawyers who know they're kind of boring people and they're probably in like a boring practice area. Like if you talk to that person who like does about ERISA, like even if you know basically nothing about ERISA, they're going to walk away thinking you were like the most charming person that they met that week.
Because I bet no one ever asked them because they think it's boring.
Yeah, exactly. So I think just, if you are in those ones where like, wow, they're just not talking a lot, the more you can get them talking and the more you can have curiosity about what they're saying, I think the better.
I agree. And it is what it is. You'll have another interviewer after. Yeah,
exactly. And you just have to kind of, in between the interviews, you sort of shake it off. Yeah. Like, all right, that didn't go so well. Like, let's reset. If you're in person, you've got a little walk down the hallway that you can kind of reset. If you're virtual, you probably have a couple of minutes between interviews. Just shake it off, move on to the next one. And like, hopefully that's a little more engaging.
Yeah, just don't get stuck, I agree, in any mode or, an answer you said that you didn't like. Just move on. You can think about it later.
Right, and definitely do not mention it to your next interviewer. Like, wow, that person was really boring.
I've seen people do that.
I think it's just like you want to connect and you're not really thinking, but you're like, wow, that was really inappropriate.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of think before you talk in all of these situations. All right, well, we're getting short on time. Let's do a couple more. What if you get a question that you don't like or you don't know how to answer it, whether that is like an offensive question for whatever reason, or if it's just one that you generally like don't enjoy?
Well, if it's offensive, like maybe even illegal, I think it's fine to say, I don't feel comfortable answering that, or that doesn't seem like a question I should be answering. And you can evaluate the firm by that. I think that's good information to have. If it's something where they ask you something specific and you don't know the answer, I think it's great to say like, oh, I'm not sure, but I'll look it up. If it's something that like you could look up, and that's an example where I would close the loop with them. And I think that says something that you really were listening and remembered and came back to it. I think there's always a way to have like a non-answer, like, oh, we haven't covered that yet, or kind of, sometimes you can sort of change the subject a little bit or kind of answer it in a way of something you're more comfortable with. But I think if it's something where you're not sure, it is another example of how you deal with the question more than what the answer was. And what you definitely don't want to do is just say something that's wrong, because you're just like coming up with something. I think that's way worse than just acknowledging that you don't know the answer.
Right, exactly. Like, don't make things up. If they ask you like, oh, my friend teaches at your school, have you taken a class with him? Oh yeah, like, the answer there, if it's no, is no.
Yeah, because you're just gonna get down this like you have to lie rabbit hole.
Lying's just not good. I think it's much better to say, oh, I haven't had a chance to like interact with him yet, but like sounds like something I would love to do, so I'll look into that for next semester.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, one more thing. So if this is going on in person, people might be invited to lunch or even dinner. What are some pitfalls to avoid in this situation?
I think actually with lunch, it's sort of two things, or dinner, any kind of, food thing. One is just basic table manners, ordering something that's not messy, that's easy to eat, ordering along the same lines as what the other person is. So if they're just ordering one course, you just order one course, no alcohol ever, 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 even if they're drinking. So sort of just, that you are, it sounds silly, but are comfortable with the utensils and your napkins in your lap, just everything's neat. And then two, not like over talking too much about casual things, because I think that is sort of, the danger of a meal, and kind of what they're looking for some of the time is to get some more stuff out of you. So, keep it professional as much as you can. If personal things come up, surface level, just don't give things away that you wouldn't have said in the regular interview, just because it feels like a more casual setting.
Definitely. I mean, I remember once talking with and they usually send the younger people to lunch with you too, so it feels more informal. And I remember talking to them one of them oh yeah, I'm not really sure if I want to be in San Francisco again yet or not. And that was stupid. I did not get an offer at that firm.
That's the exact kind of things that people say.
Yeah, because I was just oh yeah, these are my buddies. We're hanging out. We're going to lunch. They're not your buddies. It's still an interview.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to do this for 2 years and pay back as much of my student loans as possible.
Yeah, also not cool. That's not what they want to be thinking. Yeah, so just, keep it light. Be prepared to talk about some stuff that's not work related. And, I think people can get into some illegal or semi-illegal stuff unintentionally. Oh, do you have kids? Are you married? None of that's actually okay. And don't ask anyone else that either.
Absolutely. That's why I think if things get into your personal, keep it surface level, keep it, innocuous. Something to keep in mind because like you said, they do usually send the younger people or more junior people to lunch is that just because they're more junior doesn't mean they're the easy interview. I think people get really intimidated by partners and actually partners usually know how to interview better and are judging you on things that are totally legit, and they know who makes a good associate, that kind of thing. I find that the junior people really try to trip people up that are behind them sometimes, not always. And so just something to keep in mind. Don't be so loosey-goosey with the more junior people and be really nervous with the partner. A lot of times it's not in, seniority order, what's going to be the hardest.
No, that's definitely true. I've had junior people quiz me on crazy stuff on my resume where I'm seriously? Why are we talking about this? But yeah, I think, at lunch, just continue playing it kind of close to the vest. They don't need to hear every detail of your personal life about how your partner is looking for medical residencies and you're not sure where you're going to end up. None of that is needs to be on the table. This is
because they will tell everyone, just so you know.
Absolutely. Everybody you talk to is going to report back on you, on a form. Do you have any concerns about this person? Well, they're not really sure what city they want to be in. That's not going to go well. So just play it close to the vest, talk about boring things, talk about whatever sporting event is going on or the hot weather, whatever it is. There are ways that you can kill time. How's everybody's food? Oh, that looks great. What's that? There are things you can talk about.
Yeah. And maybe you have a few anecdotes from your summer job or something.
Right.
Just lighthearted. But yeah, I wouldn't get into anything about your personal life.
Definitely not. And that they shouldn't either. But, things happen. All right. Well, we are definitely out of time on this one. Any final thoughts on this topic?
Kind of what I said before about making sure that you're really in the moment and responding to the questions and listening. Because I think it's that situation where sometimes someone introduces themselves and then you can't remember their name.
Right.
Because you were thinking about what you were going to say next and you weren't listening. So I think this is what happens in interviews a lot. So, you should obviously practice and be prepared, but most of this is just going to happen in the moment and you can't anticipate it. So just kind of keep that in mind that you're going to listen.
Yeah, and I think that's equally true in a virtual setting. Make sure that you are focused on this. I know sometimes people start multitasking just because that's habitual when we're on our computer, but you shouldn't be looking at your text messages on your phone. Anything like that, just nothing distracting, nothing that's going to distract you from this person talking. And yeah, if you're not listening to them, then you can't really engage with them and it's probably not going to be a very good interview.
Exactly. And the stuff that you think they can't see, maybe they can. They can see where your eyes are.
True, exactly. They know if you're not really looking at the camera, if you're wearing glasses, people can see the reflection. There's actually a lot of information people can get on a video that you may not be thinking about.
Exactly. I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. With that, we are out of time. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, including prepping for your callback interviews, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, Please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon. Good luck with your callbacks.